Hominin evolution is messy. It's not a ladder, not a straight path leading right to us. Think of it more like a very bushy tree. Lots of branches grew out. Some branches were thick and lasted a long time. Others were thin and broke off quickly. Most of those branches eventually died. They went extinct. That's just how evolution works. Most species don't make it forever. And when a branch dies out without leaving any descendants that survive, that's what we call an evolutionary dead end. The question is, what was the biggest one for hominins? What species or group of species had a good run, maybe seemed successful, but ultimately their path ended completely? Their line stopped, they didn't lead to us or to any other hominin that's alive today. We've had a lot of hominin species, far more than just us. For millions of years, there were often several different kinds of hominins walking the earth at the same time. Some were more ape-like, some more human-like. They ate different things, they lived in different places, and they had different evolutionary fates. Let's look at some of the contenders. First, there are the very early ones, things like Sahelanthropus, Australopithecus. These are super ancient, maybe 7 to 4 million years ago. They might be our earliest ancestors after we split from chimps. But were they dead ends? It's hard to say for sure. They are so old, and the fossil record is so patchy. We don't have enough information to know if they directly led to later hominins, or if they were just early experiments in bipedalism that faded out. They were important beginnings, but not necessarily big dead ends in the sense of a fully developed lineage that failed. Then we get to the Australopithecines. These guys were around for about 4 to 2 million years ago. Think of famous fossils like Lucy and Australopithecus afarensis. These were definitely hominins. They walked upright, but they still had ape-like brains and spent time in trees. Many species of Australopithecus existed. Australopithecus anamensis, afarensis, garhi, sediba. And some others. Were these dead ends? Well, Australopithecus afarensis, or a very similar species, likely gave rise to our genus Homo. So that particular lineage wasn't a dead end in the strictest sense, but many Australopithecus species probably were. They were side branches that just didn't go anywhere. They represent a diverse group of early hominins, some of which were ancestral to us, and many of which were not. But there's a specific group within this broader family that really stands out as a clear evolutionary dead end. These are the robust Australopithecines. Scientists usually put them in their own genus, Paranthropus. Think Paranthropus robustus, Paranthropus boisei, and Paranthropus aethiopicus. These hominins were around roughly 2.7 to 1.2 million years ago, and they were remarkable. They lived alongside early Homo species, including our direct ancestors, but they looked very different. While early Homo was starting to develop bigger brains and more generalized diets, Paranthropus went down a different path. Their defining feature was their chewing apparatus. They had massive jaws, enormous molars, and thick enamel on their teeth. Some species had a bony ridge on the top of their skull called a sagittal crest. This crest served as an anchor point for huge chewing muscles. Imagine a gorilla's head, but for a hominin. That's the kind of power they had in their bite. This extreme setup tells us a lot about what they ate. They were specialized eaters. They crunched on tough, fibrous plant foods, nuts, seeds, roots, tubers. Stuff that was hard to chew. This was probably an adaptation to fluctuating environments in Africa. When preferred foods were scarce, they could rely on these fallback foods that others might not have been able to process. It was a successful strategy for a long time. They survived for over 1 million years. That's a good run for any species, but this specialization became their downfall. When the environment changed too much, or too quickly, their diet might have become too restricted. They couldn't adapt, they were locked into their tough food menu. Early Homo, on the other hand, was more of a generalist. We had smaller teeth, lighter jaws, and a more varied diet, including meat. This flexibility allowed early Homo to survive environmental changes and exploit new food sources. Paranthropus didn't have that flexibility, so around 1.2 million years ago, the Paranthropus lineage vanished. They left no descendants. Their unique, specialized evolutionary path ended completely. They were a successful strategy for a time, but one that ultimately proved to be a dead end. They are a strong contender for a big dead end because they were a distinct, widespread, and long-lived group of hominins that went extinct without contributing to any later surviving hominin lines. Their story is a clear example of how over-specialization can be a trap in a changing world. But were they the biggest dead end? They were successful in their time, but perhaps not as complex or widespread as later hominins. Let's move on to the genus Homo, our own genus. We often think of Homo as a single, unstoppable march towards modern humans. But that's not true either. Consider Homo erectus. This species emerged around 1.9 million years ago and was incredibly successful. They were the first hominins to leave Africa, spreading across Asia and maybe even into Europe. They made more advanced stone tools, possibly used fire, and lived for a very long time, maybe up until 100,000 years ago or even more recently in some places. Homo erectus was clearly an ancestor to later Homo species, including us, so the lineage continued. But specific populations of Homo erectus in places like China or Indonesia likely died out without evolving further. Their local branches were dead ends. However, the species itself was a foundational ancestor. So, it's not a dead end in the same way Paranthropus was. What about some of the more puzzling and recently discovered hominins? Homo floresiensis, often called hops. These tiny hominins lived on the island of Flores in Indonesia until perhaps as recently as 50,000 years ago. They were incredibly small, maybe only 3 feet tall, and had tiny brains. They likely evolved from an earlier Homo erectus population that got isolated on the island. The island environments can cause animals to become much smaller dwarfism due to limited resources. Homo floresiensis made tools and hunted. They were unique, but they were also very geographically restricted. Their extinction was probably due to a combination of factors, including small population size, environmental changes, or perhaps the arrival of modern humans, Homo sapiens. They are a fascinating dead end, a unique experiment in hominin evolution. But were they the biggest? Their limited geographic range and isolated nature might argue against that. They represent a very specialized localized dead end. Then there's Homo naledi. Discovered in a cave system in South Africa in 2013, this species has been a mystery. They have a mix of primitive features, small brain, curved fingers for climbing, and human-like features, hands, feet, upright posture. What's really surprising is their relatively late date. They might have been alive between 335,000 and 236,000 years ago. This means they coexisted with larger-brained hominins, possibly even early Homo sapiens. Their small brains, combined with evidence that they may have deliberately deposited their dead in a cave, makes them truly enigmatic. They are almost certainly a side branch, another evolutionary dead end. They didn't lead to us. But like Homo floresiensis, they seem to be a more localized and perhaps less globally significant dead end compared to others. This brings us to the strongest contender for the biggest evolutionary dead end for hominins, the Neanderthals, Homo neanderthalensis. Neanderthals are special. They weren't some distant, primitive ancestor, they were our close cousins. Our evolutionary siblings, you could say. They shared a common ancestor with us, Homo sapiens, somewhere around 600,000 to 700,000 years ago, perhaps a species like Homo heidelbergensis. For hundreds of thousands of years, they were the dominant hominins in Europe and parts of Western Asia. Let's understand who Neanderthals were. They weren't the brutish, unintelligent cavemen often depicted in old cartoons. Far from it. They were incredibly well adapted to the cold, harsh environments of Ice Age Europe. Their bodies were stocky, robust, and powerfully built, with wide rib cages and short limbs. This body shape helped them conserve heat. They had large noses, which might have helped warm and moisten cold, dry air before it reached their lungs. Their brains were, on average, even slightly larger than ours today, though organized a bit differently. Neanderthals were sophisticated hunters. They used strong, thrusting spears to take down large prey like mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, and reindeer. This was dangerous work. Their skeletons often show evidence of many fractures, similar to those seen in modern rodeo riders. They made a variety of stone tools, often called Mousterian tools, which were more advanced than earlier toolkits. They crafted scrapers, points, and knives from carefully prepared stone cores. They were also cultural beings. We have evidence that Neanderthals cared for their sick and elderly. Some individuals survived for years with severe injuries or disabilities, suggesting a strong sense of community and compassion. They buried their dead, sometimes with grave goods or in specific positions, which hints at symbolic thought or a belief system. There's increasing evidence that they adorned themselves with shell beads, eagle talons, and used pigments, suggesting an aesthetic sense or symbolic communication. They also appear to have created art like cave etchings and possibly used feathers and other decorative items. Neanderthals were incredibly successful for a very long time. They flourished across a vast geographic range, adapting to significant climate changes over hundreds of thousands of years. They were intelligent, capable, and resilient. This was not a species that failed quickly or was inherently maladaptive. They were a thriving, advanced hominin species, and then around 40,000 years ago, their story ends. They vanished. Their distinct species, Homo neanderthalensis, ceased to exist. Their extinction coincides with the arrival and spread of Homo sapiens into Europe. This is what makes them the biggest evolutionary dead end. They weren't a small, isolated branch. They weren't an overly specialized group like Paranthropus. They were a major player, a sophisticated hominin that had achieved widespread success, only to completely disappear from the fossil record. So why did they die out? This is one of the most debated questions in human evolution. There's no single simple answer. It was likely a combination of factors. One, climate change. The period around 40,000 years ago was marked by rapid and dramatic climate fluctuation. Europe experienced several very cold, dry periods. While Neanderthals had adapted to cold before, the rate and severity of these changes might have pushed them to their limits. Their resource availability would have become highly unstable. However, they had endured many such changes before. So climate alone might not be the whole story. So too, competition with Homo sapiens, this is often seen as the primary factor. Modern humans arrived in Europe from Africa around 45,000 to 50,000 years ago. In technology, early Homo sapiens developed more diverse and innovative toolkits, including projectile weapon spear throwers, bows and arrows that allowed them to hunt from a distance, reducing risk. They also developed tools for fishing and small game hunting, expanding their diet. The Neanderthal tools, while effective, remained somewhat less varied and advanced. Dietary breadth. While Neanderthals were hypercarnivores in many regions relying heavily on large game, Homo sapiens had a broader diet, including more fish, birds, small mammals, and plant foods. This flexibility might have given them an advantage when large game became scarce. The social networks and demographics, Homo sapiens appears to have lived in larger, more interconnected social groups. This would have facilitated the sharing of knowledge, resources, and provided a larger gene pool. Neanderthal populations seem to have been smaller and more isolated. Smaller populations are more vulnerable to disease, genetic drift, and local extinctions. Even slightly higher birth rates or lower mortality rates in Homo sapiens could have led to a demographic advantage over tens of thousands of years. Cognitive advantages. While Neanderthals were intelligent, some researchers suggest Homo sapiens might have had slightly superior cognitive abilities in areas like abstract thought, planning, language, or innovation. This is very hard to prove from fossils, but even subtle differences could have given a competitive edge over millennia. For example, Homo sapiens seems to have engaged in more symbolic behavior, trading networks, and potentially had more complex language. This is a common pattern when two previously isolated populations meet. Diseases could have decimated Neanderthal populations, especially if they were already stressed by climate or competition. Many people of non-African descent today carry 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA in their genomes. This means that Neanderthal genes were passed on to us. However, this interbreeding was not enough to save Neanderthals as a distinct species. The populations of Homo sapiens were likely much larger, meaning that any offspring of mixed unions would have been absorbed into the larger Homo sapiens gene pool. The unique Neanderthal lineage and distinct physical characteristics eventually faded out. So, while their genes live on in us, the species Homo neanderthalensis disappeared. This is a form of extinction for the species itself. When we consider all these factors, the extinction of Neanderthals stands out as the biggest evolutionary dead end. Scale. They were widespread across a continent and endured for hundreds of thousands of years. This wasn't a small, isolated group. Sophistication. They weren't primitive. They were highly intelligent, cultural, and adapted hominins. Their eventual disappearance feels more profound because they were so advanced. Their proximity to us. They were our closest relatives. Their story is a stark reminder that even a very successful hominin species can disappear. They represent an alternative path that nearly made it. A truly human-like species that just didn't survive into the present day as itself. Their extinction closes a chapter on a parallel form of humanity. Their disappearance teaches us that evolution isn't about progress or a guaranteed path to higher forms. It's about survival. It's about adaptation to changing circumstances. And sometimes, even a highly successful species can meet its end when faced with new challenges, especially when those challenges come in the form of a closely related, perhaps slightly more flexible competitor. The Neanderthals were a robust, intelligent, and culturally rich species, but ultimately their unique evolutionary journey came to an end. They represent the most significant and perhaps most poignant evolutionary dead end in the hominin story.